ESMA and was involved in the report. So I'm just going to open our event with a few brief points on housekeeping, and then I will pass over to ESMA's Chief Economist and Head of Risk Analysis, Stefan Kern. But the main thing to be aware of, as was also communicated previously, is that the session will be recorded and then will be available on the website. So we can then, I think, cover further details as we come to them during the event. And with that, I'll hand over to Stefan for his opening remarks. Stefan.
Thank you so much, Alex, and warm welcome also from my side to all of you for this webinar on crowdfunding. It's an exquisite pleasure to have so many of you on this call and give us the opportunity to share with you our main findings and insights when we looked into the EU crowdfunding market, and also then subsequently to discuss with you our current findings as well as the broader context of this. Now, this is particularly delightful for us because we are in pioneering terrain on the crowdfunding side, because it's the first time we can actually take an authoritative look at crowdfunding data and the crowdfunding market overall in the European Union. It's the first annual market report we publish on crowdfunding, and it is based on data that are originally sourced on the crowdfunding market in the European Union, probably as comprehensive as it gets. We get these data from national authorities, and all of this is actually based on the European Crowdfunding Service Providers for Business regulation. So this brings us a very complete picture of what is going on in the European market for crowdfunding at the moment. In fact, our sample covers 98 crowdfunding service providers in 17 member states, and we find that the market is larger than 1 billion in crowdfunding sourcing in the EU for 2023. I'm not going into the details. We are, of course, and Alex will carry you through this, covering many angles of the EU crowdfunding market, including the funding models themselves, the investors and the structures there, the investments that the crowdfunding providers actually undertake, and of course also a geographic breakdown of the activities that we see in the market. So it's a very rich document and very rich findings on that market. Now, enhancing the potential of EU capital markets is really high on the agenda these days. It's very topical against the background, not least of the Savings and Investment Union. And it is therefore all the more important that we actually shed light on the crowdfunding market, which is one financing source in the European Union. Clearly, it is not a very large market. There is larger ones, there is larger funding sources in the EU, but it is hugely innovative. And it is particularly interesting for small investors on the investor side and for small projects and enterprises on the financing side. So it is speaking to very important parts of the CMU and SIU discussions as we see them in Brussels going on these days. The regulation on which all of this is based aims to enable providers to scale up across borders in a harmonized framework. So we have a European framework for crowdfunding, a legal framework, and that actually promotes the growth of this market. And ESMA plays a role in this because we as an institution have been tasked with fostering a harmonized regulatory environment across the EU to enhance the efficiency of crowdfunding and also to take a strong focus on investor protection in this context. Also, of course, and as part of this, we undertake the market monitoring of this market, and with that we support the convergence and future policy work on crowdfunding in the European Union. So this report is a first very important step to understand how the market has developed so far and to see where it may be possible to strengthen it. Now, all of this, of course, is in support of the regulation and how we implement it, and it's a very, very strong basis on which to assess not just current market developments, but also, like I said, future policy options. Let me now turn to the specifics for a more in-depth account of the article, we'll first have a presentation from Alex Harris, our senior analyst who actually worked on the report together with colleagues at ESMA. And then after this presentation, our colleague Salvatore Gnoni is going to join us. He's the head of ESMA's Investor Protection and Intermediaries Unit, and he will discuss with us the relevance of the analysis from a policy perspective. And like I said, of course, this is happening in the context of strong discussions in Brussels, not just on SIU, but also on retail issues. And this discussion is very dynamic and engaging. And in advanced stages, there is not much to say at the moment on the specifics there, but it will certainly be very important to contextualize our findings from that perspective. All of that will conclude with a Q&A session and giving you also the opportunity to ask questions. And Valentina Medal from our department will moderate that discussion. Valentina was also involved in producing the report. And during that session, my colleagues will be very happy to answer any questions that you might have and that you might want to enter in the chat function. I hope that you very much enjoy this presentation and the discussion. Certainly, I'm looking forward to your views and to your questions. And I thank you again for your interest in our work. And with that, I hand it over back to Alex. Thank you.
Good morning again, everybody, and welcome to this session on my behalf as well. So I will get into the background of the report and then the main results, and then look forward to hearing from you if you have questions or observations on them. But as you'll have seen from the market report itself, we have a mandate to publish aggregate annual statistics on the market, and that's on an annual basis on data reported to ESMA from our national competent authorities. But the regulation as a whole, the ECSPR, covers investment-based and lending-based crowdfunding services, specifically related to business financing. And under the regulation, authorized platforms can then gain the right to offer services across the union. So it harmonizes what was more piecemeal regulatory framework with different national regulations in place. That's partly aiming to ensure that providers can scale up and therefore also unlock capital for businesses, especially small and medium enterprises in the EU. The regulation also contains provisions around investor protection and education. And then for ESMA specifically, we have a mandate to maintain a register of providers. There are also several policy mandates. So ESMA has published technical standards as well as implementing and delegated acts. And then, yeah, the Article 16 requirement that we have to publish annual statistics is the basis for this report. So coming on to what we've found, we have a sample of 98 providers across 17 member states. We will be continuing to improve data quality and coverage, though it's worth noting that in several member states, so 5 this time around, it was confirmed that there were no providers present. In other cases, we will continue to work on expanding the coverage, but we have a good and broad sample for this first set of results. By funding type, we can see that loan-based crowdfunding is the dominant form of financing. So we have both the highest number of projects and also the greatest number of providers. This is the left-hand chart below. And then we can also see, if we look at the amounts invested and the numbers of investors, that loan-based crowdfunding is equally, if not more, dominant in that regard. Another statistical finding was that the average amount invested per project is higher for debt-based or equity-based crowdfunding than for loan-based crowdfunding. And here it's worth pointing out that the difference between debt-based and loan-based is one of effectively securitization. So if you can transfer your stake in a crowdfunding project as an investor, then it would be debt-based as opposed to loan-based, assuming it's to do with lending money. The results also cover the type of investors who were involved. So we see retail investors being the largest group of investors. There's also categories of sophisticated and professional investors. So professional investors are designated under MiFID. Sophisticated investors are designated under the new crowdfunding regulations, so that it's a somewhat analogous category. We see actually, if we break down by the total amount invested per investor, much higher amounts for professional investors who tend to invest, or at least on average, over 4,000 euros, whereas it's under 1,000 euros, both for retail and sophisticated investors, but retail being the lowest amount. So this is what we roughly would perhaps expect to see. We know that crowdfunding generally, there's other information available, is something that caters to retail investors. And that's something that it's good to have further insight on here and to confirm our expectations. If we look at the range of projects by economic sector, so thinking now more from the point of view of the project as opposed to the person investing in it, we see that professional, scientific and technical activities, so this is shortened to professional activities on the graph, has the largest amount of money invested in it, between 300 and 400 million in 2023. The other categories are also listed there. So in terms of the highest number of investors, that was real estate. Now, the categories that we have available under the structure of the data, according to the reporting regime, are fairly broad. So they're at NACE level 1, to be technical. So I think it gives us an overview of the type of economic activity being supported. But it's something where it would be maybe interesting to hear from you if you have any more kind of fine-grained detail on the types of projects that are being supported. Thinking then about the cross-country breakdown, we have large numbers of providers being registered in a few jurisdictions with relatively large amounts of money being raised in France and also in the Netherlands. We see that Lithuania and Estonia-based platforms have relatively many investors. And another metric that we can use is to look at the cross-border share of investments. And we see, this is the top chart on this slide, that there is a large degree of variation. So in some countries, for instance, Austria, the first on the upper chart, we see around 80% of investments actually cross-border. So the invested amounts come from residents in another country. There we would expect quite a large degree of cross-border activity between certain jurisdictions. So from kind of anecdotal evidence or speaking to the industry, we understand there may be quite a lot of providers which would provide German-speaking investors with services. So we would see relatively high amounts of German investors, for instance, investing in Austrian platforms on that measure. We also see investing by country of investor residence. So interestingly, around a quarter, according to the statistics, of adult residents in Lithuania invested in crowdfunding. Now, that seems to be an impressively high level of market participation among investors. It's worth noting that Lithuania has had a crowdfunding regime in place nationally for many years. I think one thing we would at least hope is that this indicates there is scope for crowdfunding to gain more traction across the union in other countries. So Lithuania and some other countries tend to be centers for crowdfunding or hubs for crowdfunding, and they've benefited from having clear national rules in place for many years. Now that we have an EU framework in place, I think that indicates that there will be scope for further cross-border scaling up of platforms, again unlocking capital, especially for small and medium enterprises. So that's a summary of the results. We've had, I think, an interesting, relatively high-level overview of the sector, which the idea will be to build on that for future iterations of our reports. So I think as we begin to have further observations in other years, and as the regulation becomes more embedded and providers are authorized increasingly under the new regime, we will be able to do year-on-year analysis and see if there are important trends. One trend that we're aware of from, again, other market analysis and discussions with stakeholders is that there has been in recent years some consolidation in the industry with providers merging or acquiring others. And if that trend for consolidation continues, would be interesting for us to begin to analyze as we build up that time series. So we would, when it comes to the Q&A session, we will be very interested to hear if there are views that you have on the results that we have. Perhaps you can help us interpret the results based on your knowledge of the sector. You may also have questions about how we conducted the analysis or the findings that we reached. So we will very much look forward to hearing from you then. However, I will now hand over to Salvatore Gnoni, who is the head of our Investor Protection Intermediaries unit at ESMA. And Salvatore will give a few remarks on the relevance from a policy perspective of the findings.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, everybody. I think that thanks for this webinar, thanks for the report. I think that the report offers a really good overview of the crowdfunding landscape in the EU. And because it gives an idea of the market size, the growth trends, and where the key players may be located. Also the detailed breakdown of crowdfunding models, equity-based, loan-based, is also useful for us in terms of also policy making and deciding what to focus on, to understand the diverse and evolving nature of this young or relatively young industry. As mentioned by Stefan in his opening remarks, the report is an important tool for policy making, because only by understanding the market and the situation on the ground, we may be able to focus on issues which deserve some attention under a policy standpoint. And when I mention policy, I mean it in a quite broad sense, including by assessing the regulatory matters and also working on the application of the regulation by firms and by supervisors. And this is what it's a typical activity that we call as a supervisory convergence. In the supervisory community, we call it a supervisory convergence. In this respect, indeed, the European crowdfunding regulation has been an achievement in itself, because it has overcome the fragmentation which was arising from purely national legislation by introducing a regime to regulate the crowdfunding market across the entire EU. This is clearly an opportunity. This gives opportunity to players and to investors. This raises also issues on how clearly to supervise this and or this interaction between on a cross-border basis between those in search of funding and those giving the funding. What we've done so far, in policy terms, has been, first of all, to focus on what we call the single rule book, that is the rules, writing the rules, as Alex was mentioning already. So clearly, after the adoption of the crowdfunding regulation at legislative level. So clearly we have supported the European Commission in adopting what we call level 2 measures, so technical standards, we call them. Many of them, if you are working in the area, you will know them clearly. And then after that, this has been a significant effort, especially in the first period. Then there has been also a transitional period to facilitate the move between national and European level. And then now we sit together, we sit down together with the supervisors, the competent authority, national supervisors, in order to see how the sector is progressing in terms of applying the rules, and again in the context of what I called before supervisor convergence, and where, for example, needs for clarifications emerge. As you have seen, the report focuses significantly on the investor dimension and especially the retail investor angle. This is obviously one of the important aspects for ESMA, and clearly this is an important driver also for our action. And as I said, the more we understand the structure of the EU crowdfunding market, the better we can target specific aspects for our work. For example, we have seen with interest that while being a newly regulated activity in the EU, there is already a clear cross-border dimension in this area. So Alex has just given us some numbers or some ideas around this cross-border dimension, and with already some identifiable features in terms of home and also jurisdictions, so importing and exporting countries, for example. In policy terms, probably it would be interesting to get additional information, if this was feasible, on aspects such as additional granularity of the sectors which are benefiting from crowdfunding financing, or additional information, for example, on investors' demographics, in order not to be able to calibrate better, even further, the supervisor or regulatory actions. Obviously, here we rely entirely on our colleagues, to see whether and how additional details can be obtained and when. But I was just mentioning aspects that can be relevant, for example, in the perspective of supervision, and therefore also translating into more targeted policy making. I also understand that for this first report, there were, understandably, because it's pretty normal for the beginning of the exercises, there were some data quality issues, because clearly also the reporting was a new type of reporting, by competent authorities and by firms. And I wanted to say that together with the national supervisors, ESMA will work to ensure that the reporting exercise is further improves and is even more reliable. Although, as I said, it was already an important, gave already to us an important dimension of the crowdfunding activity across the European Union. Obviously, it's important to have reliable data in order to understand the sector. Everything that I said is just to confirm that this report and its future potential development are clearly a key aspect for ESMA. Also considering that we will have to stand ready to prepare the analysis for the review of the crowdfunding regulation. There is an article, one of the last articles in the regulation is Article 45, for those who are interested in numbers in legislation, which has a long list of aspects to be reviewed, and therefore there obviously the initiative belongs to the European Commission, but clearly as supervisors at national, at European level, we must be ready And the more data we have, the easier it will be also to assess collectively, together with the industry also, how the regulation has worked and whether some review is needed. With these few words, I would like to thank again Alex and the colleagues who have worked on this report, but also the colleagues at the national level who have now collected and reported clearly the data. And it is very good to see the interest that this report triggers among the market participants, as I can see from the level of attendance in this webinar today. So with these few words, I thank you again, and I give you back the floor, Alex.
Thanks very much, Salvatore. So we will now turn to the questions, and I see we have a few already in the chat, which is very encouraging. I'll hand over now to my colleague Valentina, who, as I think Stefan mentioned, also produced the report, and she will act as moderator for this Q&A session. Valentina.
Thank you very much, Alex and colleagues, and thank you for your interest to this report. And also, I would maybe highlight what just Salvatore said. Also, thank you to national authorities who provided data, because this is the basis for our report. And yeah, the first question in the chat is about sustainability-related crowdfunding compared to non-sustainability-related. The short answer, straightforward answer, would be no. And I will explain why. We have a breakdown by economic sector, by economic activities, according to NCAs, and you'll find it in the report. However, we don't have this information because, as it was already explained, the data we collect from national authorities is the data that national authorities receive from crowdfunding platforms. And there are 3 basic points on which they collect this data on confidential basis also. And these 3 points are the project owner and the amount raised on this platform. Second is the instrument issued, meaning it's investment or lending based. So that's how we actually, our first statement was that lending based is a prominent activity. And then finally, aggregated information about investors and invested amounts broken down by fiscal residency of investors, where we distinguish between sophisticated and not sophisticated. So also this statement allowed us to make statements about, again, that it's mostly sophisticated, non-sophisticated who invest. So these are the 3 main points, and it would not allow us to provide this information. However, already even with these data points, we do expect this report to evolve in the future and have some trends in terms of the number of platforms. Through the exchanges with stakeholders, we've heard about some trend of concentration, for example, and maybe in the future it will allow us to actually assess whether there is this trend. Then, yeah, I also mentioned demographics probably of investors is also something that we would aim in the future.
Yeah, maybe many thanks, and maybe Alex, I will take the next one. In terms of policy initiatives to allow increased recommendation of crowdfunding products. The next one, and also the last one on sustainability related crowdfunding compared to non-sustainability related. So. This is a good question, as I think Stefan already mentioned. With the new commission, the new institutions, there is clearly a new focus on the saving and investment new union. So clearly, crowdfunding regulation, as we know, was one of the first regulatory initiatives rising in the concept of the capital market union, the CMU as we knew it. Now this initiative has evolved into a saving and investment union. We are all waiting for a paper by the Commission, a strategic paper by the Commission to be published in the coming months. We know the Commission is working on that. Besides that, so I'm not sure whether there will be anything specific on crowdfunding, but as I also said, there is a significant review clause already in the regulation, which the Commission is able to activate, and we will be also ready now to look at it, to look at the various granular aspects that are mentioned in this review requirement, review clause. So obviously, while in certain jurisdictions, as Alex was saying, their activity was already regulated, in many other jurisdictions it was not. So obviously it's a new activity with the distinct features, and therefore we can also understand that there is a relatively slow progress, and also in the interest by investors. Investors traditionally, they have some behavioral biases in terms of not necessarily fully relying in fairly new initiatives, although it's also true that the current digital channels facilitate clearly investments, and we can see this in other areas. On the last point, the one on the sustainability related versus non-sustainability related, I think that this was exactly one of my points before, whether it would be feasible in the future to have a more granular type of data collection in terms of being able to capture this dimension. We have also to admit that, however, the sustainability, the sustainable finance related discussion is much wider, and currently there are, as many of you surely will know, there are many discussions on this regulatory part, on the regulatory part of this activity, and therefore probably we have also to be careful before to have some clarity on that side, before being more granular, because in order to ask more granularity on a given aspects, you have to know how to capture that aspects. And now there is also all this discussion of taxonomy, for example, on greenwashing, which are also relevant. Therefore, probably this will come as a further development across the board, actually, not only for crowdfunding. Then we are also aware that there is a discussion on a simplification and burden reduction on reporting requirements. Therefore, the picture that will evolve in the coming months and probably years will depend also on the balance that we will reach under the SIU, under the Saving and Investment Union. I'll stop here and give the floor back to Alex and Valentina for there are other questions on the report itself, which is the most important part of the day, clearly.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. So I see there are a few other questions in the chat, some of which I can also try to answer. So one question was on whether we have an estimate for how the market could be, or so the potential market size for the crowdfunding market in the EU. We don't have a specific estimate there, but I just provided some thoughts in the chat. So I made the general observation in the presentation that the fact there is a large degree of variation could give some indication. So you perhaps wouldn't want to simply extrapolate and say, well, if every country had the same number of investors as the highest one, which was Lithuania, or the highest share of the population, that would perhaps be a little bit of a sort of oversimplified approach. But nonetheless, I think it's instructive to consider that in broad terms. And equally, the fact that we see quite a variation in cross-border business, well, there may be specific reasons for that. We see typically scaling up happens sometimes across the union as a whole, but sometimes in particular markets which might be linked in different ways, for instance, linguistically. And we can also see that in regimes, as I mentioned, or in countries which have had national regimes in place for several years, the market tends to be somewhat more developed. So there again, I think we wouldn't want to put a figure on it as such, but if you wanted to get some idea, you could do a kind of rough extrapolation yourself to get some sort of approximate idea there. But again, it wouldn't necessarily be a definitive estimate of how far things can go. It would probably be, in some sense, a lower bound, because it may be also that the most developed markets can develop further too. There is a question, so the first one I can see on the list, which is from Andreas, which is, could you give insight on the average amounts raised per project regarding the different financial instruments? I don't have the figures to hand, but I remember that we had around 3 times the typical investment size in both debt-based and equity-based crowdfunding compared to loan-based. It's again hard to give a definitive answer, but I think the insight might be that we also tended to see smaller amounts tended to be invested by retail investors, but there are more retail investors. So there may be some connection there. We may expect there to be a different profile of investor type by instrument type, and it may be then that retail investors are more familiar or comfortable with certain funding types. So it may be, for instance, that providers of loan-based crowdfunding may try to cater to specific types of investor predominantly. That's a rather general response, but I think probably there is something of that kind going on. And then I see also in the chat we had a question, for instance, on a more practical point: will the data sources from the presented graphics be available somewhere? So I think that the idea is that in some cases where people would like to, for instance, replicate charts themselves, then they can do so using the aggregate figures. So we can look into that. It's something that we can, in some cases, make available for that purpose. But I will just need to check and get back to you on that specifically, because there may be different constraints in place. So with that, we've answered, I think, several of the questions. There may have been more that have appeared since I started with my response too. So there's a question also on the geographic scope. Do we distinguish crowdfunding from peer-to-peer lending? And also, do we consider only platforms based or headquartered in the EU? So on peer-to-peer lending and crowdfunding, the regulation is for lending to business. So if by peer-to-peer you had in mind individuals to individuals for their own projects, it would not be within the scope of this exercise. And then the geographic scope for providers, so there it would be whether platforms are authorized under the regulation itself. So we then have a question also on the timing. So are we looking ahead to 2024? This is from Florence. Sorry, the names are a little bit abridged on my screen, so I can't see the surnames very well. But Florence asks, are you looking ahead to 2024? 2023 probably only concerns a small part of the market, as many platforms only obtained their authorized status under the regulation in October, November. I think that's a very good point and very well conveyed. So thank you. Yes, we are starting to look at the exercise for 2024. We would hope to publish the market report for 2024 later this year. And we will expect to see indeed greater uptake, more providers in the figures. We did see quite a lot of registrations later in 2023, as you mentioned. I think it will be interesting to have a time series, but certainly for these first 2 years, we might also see some effects which are more to do with things getting up and running, so registrations and authorizations taking place. So we can start to do some inference once we have another year of data this year, but we will bear that in mind when we're interpreting it. Then I think in future years, we will start to see more kind of true trends and developments. Just scrolling down to see if there are further questions in the chat. I believe the others were largely focused on policy aspects, which Salvatore commented on, or also sustainability and some other aspects, which I think Valentina has already mentioned. So Valentina, do you think there's anything else we should be covering?
Yeah. Indeed, thank you, Alex. Just to complement the question on the amounts raised by projects, it's in the report. So the average amount raised per loan-based project was around 15,000, debt-based projects 33,000, and equity-based project is 46,000. So that's what Alex explained already, that equity loan-based are smaller usually. It's also related to sophisticated, not sophisticated. And then the second point that was about cross-border activities, and we have some data for this because, as I mentioned, the third data point that we received from national authorities is about the provenance of investors. So what we collected as data is that around 15% of total funding was cross-border from other EU and EEA countries, and only 2% of total funding came from residents of third countries. So that's the answer to your question about funding from outside Europe.
Thanks, Valentina. So I see we also have some questions on, for instance, the default rates of different projects. So we don't have that information ourselves. It's not something that's provided under the data template and specification of the regulation. However, I'm aware that other bodies have looked into this question. So I think in our market report, we have a footnote which, for instance, talks about a 2023 report by the Crowdfunding Research Centre at the University of Agder, which then covers 2021 to 2022 data, and the report covers some demographic statistics which are interesting that we note in the footnotes, and also default rates. And I think that is a very important components of the analysis for the market as a whole. So it's not something that's in scope for our reports, but we're very interested to follow research in that area. I think default rates as well as average rates of return for investors, and then possibly adjusting that for default risk, is something clearly relevant from the perspective of understanding the market and understanding risks and opportunities for investors and retail investors in particular. So thank you, Nicola, for that question. And yes, unfortunately, we don't have any new information on that. But this is the sort of topic that we would like to keep in touch with industry representatives and other experts. So we expect to do some outreach also later, perhaps in the middle of the year, summer or autumn. We would perhaps be in touch with other experts to try to make sure we have a good picture of market developments there. So I'm just checking also to see if there are any final questions. There's another question from Julio, who asks again about whether we can provide the underlying data for the chart. So we will confirm when we have an answer on that. But I think it's something we can look into. It would also be interesting. We have a question on collecting other regulatory approvals or statuses required by platforms. There again, I think we're constrained by the regulation as to what we can include in the data set. Just finally checking to see if there are any other questions for us to cover. Do you consider to make available information on average application processing time and annual costs and application costs for national authority, because there may be high variation from country to country? Again, that's not something that is foreseen in the scope of the data collection in the regulation at present, but I can see it would be something that's of interest to the market as a whole. So with that, I think, yeah, we also have some updates, so some remarks. Nicola has described how they've conducted market estimates based on consumer surveys in 12 EU countries. That's the Sustainable Finance Observatory. So there are some links there in the Q&A which you may find interesting that have been shared. So thanks for that. And good to see also we have some other participants who've reached out and said they'd be happy to talk to us perhaps further in more detail. So yeah, thanks very much. We will make a note of all the requests for further meetings or follow-up. That's much appreciated. Calendar for the 2024 report is also asked for. So it would be expected by the end of this year. So the last market report was published in January. I think we would probably aim slightly earlier this time around, so before the end of the calendar year. We don't have a more precise timetable or a date, but we can make sure that we publicise clearly when it's available. There's also a question about the review under Article 45. I'm not aware of details there. Not sure if Salvatore would want to comment, but yeah, if not, then I think we wouldn't have further information on the timetable there. So yeah, with that, sorry, Salvatore. Yeah, there's a question about there's a review under Article 45 that you mentioned, and yeah, the question is there any more detailed information on the timing? But I'm not sure if there would be. Sorry, Salvatore, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. No, because indeed this depends a bit on the Commission. The initiative is with the Commission. Clearly, we will be involved together with the EBA, the European Banking Authority. We expect therefore to receive a request for advice or for information, and at that moment, surely we will run some also public type of consultation. But however, the initiative lies with the European Commission and not with ESMA or the EBA.
So thanks very much, Salvatore. I think with that we've covered all the questions we can. I think there may be a couple of others with suggestions for more high-level policy, but as mentioned, that's not something that we're able to cover ourselves, given discussions that are going on, for instance, with the Commission. But yeah, thanks very much for the very good engaged participation and for listening to our results. I note that we've had some of you who'd like to get in touch further with discussions, so we're very happy to go through those requests too. And again, thanks for the interest. Thank you to Salvatore for providing the perspective from a policy angle, and Valentina, thank you very much also for the discussion and Q&A that we've just done. So with that, I think we thank you again, and expect we will see many of you for future editions of this new market report, and we look forward to building on this and expanding further in future. Thanks again.